Thank you, Ty, for being here. We have tried to get Ty here for the last 2 years, and we have finally succeeded. So I'm feeling very good about this. I'd love to start by asking you to set the stage for the reckoning that you reference in your book. Can you share how you grew up and what you believed in?
Yes, Mark, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank the board of the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund for bringing me here. Allison, thank you for that great introduction. And it's great to see all of you here today. Thank you for joining us. And I see family here. First cousin Joy's here. And other, Mark Jackson, who I've known since we were captains at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, not Fort Bragg, which we can talk about more. So thank you all for coming. My background, I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, which many of you may say, oh, that isn't really the South, it's a suburb of D.C., but you should remember that Alexandria, Virginia has more streets to this day named after Confederates than any other city in the country. We should know that Alexandria, Virginia used to be part of the District of Columbia until 1847. George Washington demanded that Alexandria be part of the District of Columbia, and it retroceded back to Virginia to protect the slave trade. So it was an outpost of the bird machine in Virginia, which at the time meant that it was doing massive resistance. So when I was there, I was bused across town during the era of integration from the white elementary school, Douglas MacArthur, to the segregated all-black school. And when that happened, I was so excited because I was going to the school named after my hero. And what was the name of that school? It was a segregated all-black school that I went to for that 6th grade year, named Robert E. Lee Elementary, named in 1961 as a reaction to integration. And as I studied Confederate memorialization, I realized that they are either a monument from 1890 to 1920 to the return of the whites to political power, of celebrating white supremacy, or a reaction to integration. But growing up as a kid on Episcopal High School in Alexandria, Virginia, being a Southern, and I should say, when I say Southern, the white is usually silent. Do you know what you're right? When I say Southern, the white is usually silent. And so growing up there, it meant a certain something. It meant wearing a blue blazer, a rep tie. And back then, you used to say that you could tell the character of a person by the content of their shirt. Was it 100% cotton or was it not? And so that idea of growing up with white political power, which I didn't really realize then, but this status of growing up there meant that I idolized Robert E. Lee. And some of you may be familiar with the spinal tap scale. I don't know if anybody's old enough to know the spinal tap scale. That means, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have rated Lee an 11. And even though I thought I was a good Episcopalian, went to church every Sunday, was a head acolyte when I was in high school, I would have rated Jesus about the 6 range. He was much less tangible to me than Robert E. Lee, because that's where status occurred to me. And every part of my upbringing said this. We had the 4 flags of the Confederacy over my mantle. My dad, who is 92, still alive, grew up in Biloxi, Mississippi, and went to the University of the South on a scholarship. He had Lee and Jackson there, and would say our name is Seidule Lee, like Robert E. Lee, my hero. So I grew up believing that Lee was like a god, a military god, and every part of my life, whether it was my first chapter book, Meet Robert E. Lee, the first book I read as an adult, Gone with the Wind, or the first movie I saw at the theater, Song of the South, all of these things reinforced for me that white Southern culture meant status, it meant power, and it meant that's what I wanted to be.
Thank you. And today...
It's going to change here, though, okay? Let me just tell you, stick with me, okay? Stick with me. Every good conversion story has got to start out here, okay? Stay with me. I'm coming.
So today, you believe something quite different. How did the narrative of your beliefs shift, and what kept you anchored as you went through this 180 shift?
All right, so good. Now we've got that power down. But so here I am. Imagine that I am. So my dad moved to be a head of school in Georgia, in Walton County, Georgia, to a SEG academy. And I know probably most of you know what a segregation academies are. They all start, or the ones I'm familiar with, start in 1969. They're a reaction to finally forcing integration to schools in the South. And I graduated from high school at one of those SEG academies, 19 people in my graduating class. Of the 11, 12 schools that we played during, when I was in playing high school football, which I played even though I was small and slow, three-quarters of those schools are gone now. And where are the schools that are currently there, you can map them because wherever the most African Americans are, those schools are still extant. And so I went from, I didn't want to stay in Georgia, I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman, right? So where could I go be a Virginia gentleman? Washington and Lee University. And there, I took an ROTC scholarship because my parents divorced, I was broke, I wanted to stay in my school, and I didn't have another way to stay in, so I took an ROTC scholarship, never wanting to go in the Army, had no desire to serve. Some of my family said, only miscreants go in the service. This is the Stripes Army. If you remember the movie Stripes, one of the greatest Army movies of all time, that was the Army that I went into. So I went in Lee Chapel, which has the recumbent Lee statue. He is literally the altar on that. There's an altar, no Christian iconography, and Lee is lying on top of the altar, ready to rise in the whitest of white marble, ready to rise up for the people of his people, the white people, to fight again. He's in full Confederate uniform, and I went and then I walked by this beatified picture of Lee. I still have a picture of that. I have hair then. Man, those were beautiful days. And I went by, and there I took my commission surrounded by Confederate flags. I raised my right hand and gave the oath of office. I don't know if anybody here has ever served in the federal government or served in the military or have family that have served. We all take that oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Who were those enemies? They're Confederates. That oath was written in 1862. When it says those enemies, foreign and domestic, it's talking about Confederates, and I took it surrounded by Confederate flags. So I go in the Army, and I start to change. I no longer want to be a Virginia gentleman. There are four things that change me. The first is I want to be the best Army officer I can, and the Army is the most diverse workplace in the country. That changes me. The second thing that changes me is I marry a woman incapable of lying. And I grew up in a racist culture that is foundationally about lying. Foundationally. And she changed me slowly, but she changed me. And then the third thing that changed me is I became a scholar. And I went into the archives and I found, as I was living on Lee Road by Lee Gate in Lee housing area by Lee Child Development Center at West Point. I'm not making this up. And I go by our barracks, highest honor at West Point, dormitories, and I go by MacArthur, Washington, Eisenhower, Pershing, Sherman, Grant, and I get to Lee Barracks. And I look at that, and then I look east, and they just put up a new statue in like the early 2000s to Lee. And I go, why do they have so many things at the United States Military Academy named for Lee? So I say, oh, okay, and I go into the archives to try to figure this out. And I realized that in the 19th century, from 1865 to about 1930, that Confederates were banished from West Point for treason. They were considered traitors because they violated Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, the only crime, which says levying war against the United States is treason. Oh, that set me back on my heels. I realized they killed U.S. Army soldiers wearing the same blue. It wasn't the Union Army, it was the United States Army. That changed me. And I think the final thing that changed me is when I was head of the history department at West Point. Before I was head of the history department, every year we would brief the dean on how much do we have enough diversity. We had about 55 people in the history department, and we had one African-American officer and one woman. And we always said, oh, it's just so hard, it's so hard. And I said, there's got to be a better way. So I said, maybe most of our faculty came from former cadets. So I said, maybe if I studied the history of the black experience at West Point, I can get more African-American cadets interested in majoring in history. So I became the expert on the history of Black Americans at West Point, both the enslaved era and in the 20th century. And I discovered all these stories that I had never heard before. And I became the expert. I mentored the Black Student Union at West Point. I became the expert on this field. And the thing about it is, what you research and write about changes your character. And so that was the final thing that changed me, is not only did what I studied, but then who I talked to and what the effect that had on others. I finally realized that I did change in those 4 things.
Thank you for that. And growing up in places like Monroe, Georgia, or Alexandria, Virginia, were you aware of the history of those places as you were growing up?
No, but I will give you more. I'm incapable of giving a one-word answer. No, I was not aware that there were 11 African Americans lynched in Northern Virginia. I was not aware that my hometown of Monroe, Georgia, was the site of the last mass lynching in American history. 1946, 4 African Americans, 2 women, 2 men, were stalked, trapped, ambushed, and slaughtered, including 1 veteran. I was not aware that when I lived in Mobile, Alabama, my dad took a job as head of school at UMS, which is a school in Mobile, Alabama. I was not aware that while I was there on spring break, there was an African American lynched in 1981. In 1981. No, I was not aware of that. I was not aware of the racial violence all around me. I did not realize that the people lynched in Walton County, that their bodies were put in formaldehyde and sent to the Georgia Medical College, that their families could not do it. And when I wrote about this, trying to think about what the lynchings were like, I had no idea. And so I didn't know that Alexandria, Virginia spent only 6 hours in the Confederacy before it was occupied by the U.S. Army. So I had no idea, nor did I know about the heroes that I hero now. Samuel Tucker from Alexandria, Virginia, who graduated from Howard, took the bar exam because no school would allow him in, went and fought in Italy. In 1939, he led the first sit-in in American history at the Alexandria Public Library, and then led civil rights cases for 150 different cases, and again fought in Italy. He's my hero now, but my culture made traitors for slavery the heroes instead of those heroes who I have. We all need heroes, and we all can find who those heroes are if we expand our knowledge of history.
So as you broke up these myths that have been sort of, all around you as you were growing up, what was your biggest challenge in, sort of taking them apart, and, what kept you going?
Well, so I was chair of the Memorialization Committee at West Point, and we had lost 100 graduates killed in the wars on terror. I mean, it was really tearing the academy apart. I mean, this is about 2010, 2011. And I came up with the idea to we didn't have one room to have all the 1,550 names of West Point graduates who, in Lincoln's words, gave the last full measure of devotion to the nation. So I said, okay, we'll create this new room. And I created this room, and I had the money for it, the design, everything, except should Confederate graduates go in. And by this time, I knew what I knew. So I gave this brilliant argument to our leadership. Just ask me. No to traitors, no to those who killed U.S. Army soldiers, no to those people who wanted to create a slave republic. And by the way, the building was given by an ardent anti-Confederate who said he would never forgive those who forgot the flag to follow false gods. In law, it said no unworthy subjects in this building, and it meant Confederates. So I gave this argument, and I lost. Our leadership at West Point said, we want to bring people together. We don't want to be like the Sunni and Shia fighting for generations, which is the worst historical analogy in the history of the world. But I lost. So I go tail between my legs back to talk to my wife, again, the hero of my book, and because it certainly isn't me. And I tell her, I didn't have any success telling the facts, telling this thing. She said, well, did you tell your story, Ty? Did you tell them why this is so important to you? And I said, oh, hell no. No, I'm a historian. I tell their stories. I don't tell my story. And she told me, if you're ever to have any success, you've got to fess up about your own background. You've got to be honest about it. And so I did. I got an opportunity several years later in 2017, right after the Charlottesville violence, to go back to my alma mater of Washington and Lee. And I gave a Constitution Day speech standing over Lee's grave, framed by that recumbent statue. Luckily, they'd taken the Confederate flags out by then, done because black law school students had demanded it. And there I gave a speech called Robert E. Lee and Me and told my story first, and then called Lee a traitor for slavery, and told my school they had to address their lost cause background, address the racism in their midst. And what was the reaction? A standing ovation. Like, oh my gosh. That's when I knew the only way I could get others to listen to me was not as a know-it-all historian, but to tell my own story first.
So the military listened to you tell your historical facts about why Confederates shouldn't be included in the Hall of Honor, and they at various stages they sort of checked you. Did your relationship with the military change as you explored this, the commemoration of the Lost Cause myth embedded in the military's stance?
History is dangerous. History is dangerous because it challenges our myths, it challenges our identity, and when someone does that, the reaction can be ferocious. So in 2015, I did a video for a very conservative organization called PragerU, and the name of the video was the Civil War about slavery? And my first sentence is that the citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve the morally repugnant institution of slavery. And I go on and talk for a couple more minutes about giving explanations. Well, it went viral. Today it has like 35 million views. But neither the Army nor I was ready to be a public figure. So the Army, the Pentagon said, well, maybe we should investigate this guy for political speech because it was blowing up. To say the Civil War was about slavery, the Army was considering doing that. The Nation on the left, which is a magazine on the left, said I was a propagandist for the Army. Stars and Stripes said I was too close to a political organization. I had to go talk to the dean and to the superintendent at West Point saying, is he allowed to say the Civil War is about slavery? Because I did it in my uniform. Because I think, well, I mean, why is that a big deal to say in uniform? So it felt really scary there. And I got death threats, literal death threats that I had to pass on to the Criminal Investigation Division, who passed them on to the FBI, saying they were going to kill a U.S. Army officer because he said the Civil War is about slavery. So, and then I started self-censoring. I couldn't write honestly about the base names, though I wanted to. And so I retired from the Army in the beginning of 2020 to write this book and to be able to say what I wanted to say to whomever I wanted to say for however long I wanted to say. And when I got to Hamilton College, which is in central New York, I was going to give this hellfire damnation speech at Black Lives Matter Plaza in the summer of 2020 to say we've got to change these base names. And I called my dean because I was like, I'm a company man. I'm a former member of an obedience-based organization, the U.S. Army. And so, and they would not have given me permission. And every time I would have had to say something, they would say, I would have to say, these are my views, not the views of the U.S. Army, West Point, or the government. And I wouldn't have been able to do it anyway. So I asked her, and she goes, oh, Ty, she just pats me, oh, Ty, you're supposed to do that here. You have academic freedom here. I said, say what? What is academic freedom? And she said, but we have just one request for you here at Hamilton College. I said, oh, anything you want, Dean. What is it? She said, when you go give a talk, could you just mention that you're from Hamilton College? And I felt like Sally Field at the Oscars for you older people in the audience. They like me. They really like me. Now finally somebody appreciated what I was doing instead of constantly fighting, which is what I was in the U.S. Army. But I will say, since I left, and since the summer of George Floyd, the Army has embraced me fully. I've given talks at the Naval Academy, the Coast Guard Academy, at many other places. So now they've embraced me, but history was dangerous when I was first talking about this.
So they have embraced you, and then they asked you to serve on the naming commission. And if you could explain for the benefit of this audience what the naming commission did and the process you went through to choose, especially focusing on how you pick the new names of these military bases.
Yeah, so we had 9 Army bases. We call them posts in the Army, Army posts named after Confederates. These are some of the most awful people you could imagine. John Brown Gordon, Fort Gordon in Georgia, was named for someone who never served in the U.S. Army. a very good soldier who killed a lot of U.S. Army soldiers. After the war, he gave a speech to the black citizens of Charleston and said, if you, black people, are to demand equality, the 40 million of us white people will exterminate the 4 million of you black people in a race war. And so I did all the research on all these names, and they were terrible generals. Polk, who is started the University of South, Sewanee. I always mispronounce his first name, so I'm just going to say Polk. Those of you who went to Sewanee would probably understand the correct pronunciation. But he was the worst general in the Civil War, which is saying something. So I started writing op-eds about this. I wrote about it in my book. And then in the summer of 2020, the National Defense Authorization, which is the $1 trillion budget that gives money to the Department of Defense, they passed a codicil in it that said, we're going to create this naming commission to change that. President Trump vetoed the entire bill, first time it's been done in 60 years, because he did not want to change the base names. So he leaves office, President Biden comes in and selects 4 people for the Defense Department. I'm one of those, and then 4 people from the House and Senate Armed Services Committee select 4 more. So we come together in the winter of 2021 and spend the next 2 years working to figure out how to change this. Our major remit is to change these base names. So we went to every post that was going to have its name changed. We listened to local sensitivities, the first thing we did. The second thing we did, we put up a website to make sure that we captured all Americans, their idea of who to name this after. They had one name, Fort Spears. Not bad, except it was Fort Brittany Spears. So perhaps the American people, good that we don't give them the ability to do that. And so we go through this whole process, and then eventually and then we select it down. In fact, the person that selected the names, the head writer, is Connor Williams, who's here, who is advising the DuPont Fund, the fantastic historian. And he got us down to about 100 names, which we went back to the communities again, had to get community buy-in. What we found was there are so many American soldiers that we will never be able to recognize all of them. And if you gave me right now an hour, I would have another 10. If you gave me another hour, I'd have another 10. And I could keep doing that until I died, because there's so many American heroes, not those who chose treason to preserve slavery. And then in March, or maybe it was May, we then decided on the final 9. And one of the reasons why we were able to do it without much, it didn't take, there wasn't a lot of controversy, is because not only do we get rid of bad people, but we put good people in. So I'll give you 2 examples. Hal and Julia Moore. Fort Moore, which was Fort Benning, named after Hal Moore, the fame for the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, first big engagement in Vietnam, awarded the Distinguished Service Crosses, but also his wife. So we named after an Army family. She's the one that, instead of having a cab driver tell a family that their loved one had died, she made them come by her house and she would go with them. That started the Army's casualty notification. Name it after them. Another one I'll tell you is for Polk is Henry Johnson, who served in World War I in French uniform because they were so racist. We gave this whole division, 20,000 black soldiers, to the French and said, you serve. He was a Harlem Hellfighter, wounded 20-some times, and got the nickname Black Death. And 100 years later, President Obama gave his descendants the Medal of Honor, because we realized when we were doing this work that it's never, ever, ever too late to do the right thing. And so I'm proud to say that we removed 1,111 items that commemorated the Confederacy in our commission. We finished on time, under budget. Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Taxpayer. 100% of our recommendations were accepted and implemented, and everything is fully changed in the Department of Defense.
For those of you who sometimes despair that the government can't get things done, occasionally they can just get things done under budget, on time, and with 100% acceptance. So this is just really amazing to hear not just your journey, but the way that the military itself sort of shifted gears over time. And, we're exploring how we commemorate history here in Jacksonville. There's an organization here called 904 Forward. There are many staff and trustees of 904 Forward here in this room, and they've been carrying out commemorations of all the known lynchings that took place in Duval in partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative. But in your work on the Naming Commission, you got to commemorate the lives of people who were, beacons of light. And what do you think the impact of that renaming? You described a beautiful process. What do you think the impact of that rename will be, both on the military and on the local communities?
I think I'll answer that in two ways. The first is, every time I went to a local community, the first thing that they would tell me is, you're changing history. That's the first thing I got. Well, let me just tell you, no. So at West Point, every year at the United States Military Academy, I was there, we're going to teach the Battle of Gettysburg. Every year, Pickett's going to charge. Every year, Lee's going to lose. Guaranteed. That's history, and we do it in the classroom every day. Commemoration is about our values. It's about who inspires us. It represents the community. And if a commemoration doesn't represent the community, we can change it. We changed it in New York City when George III, we toppled that statue in 1776. And I didn't fly this time, but the last time I came to Florida, I went through Idlewild Airport. Anybody know what Idlewild Airport is? That's the old name of JFK. Used to be JFK Airport. There's somebody back there knows. Is that a Queens from Queens? Brooklyn, there we go. So shout out to Brooklyn right there. So the names change because they reflect our values. So don't worry about that. Make sure that what you do is about the values of this community. And also remember that when you name something, it doesn't reflect the person as much as it does who named it. Who named it? And as I go back and remember that Confederate memorialization is two periods, mainly 1890 to 1920, and that's when every state in the South redoes their constitutions to create Jim Crow constitutions to ensure that the South is a one-party racial police state. Remember that. It was an apartheid regime for that entire period of the Jim Crow era. So now, and most of those things were named then. So does that reflect who you are now? Well, it should. And if it doesn't, then you can totally make it for someone that it does reflect. In fact, Mara, I'm going to ask you, the state of Florida now, who is in Statuary Hall in the Congress? Does anybody know? Mary Bethune is in, and she's in the Statuary Hall, right? Right, and when was that changed? 2020, 2021? Of recently, right? So, 22? 22. So they're in Statuary Hall now. Florida took out, I think it was a Confederate. Is that right? That was there and put in a hero that represents Floridians. A shero. Thank you, ma'am. Right on. Right on. As a soldier, I was often told that I'm wrong more often before 9 o'clock in the morning than most people are all day. But it's true. So guess what? You can go in Statuary Hall. Now, you'll also go see Joe Wheeler in Confederate regalia in Statuary Hall representing the state of Alabama. And they put him there. It could have been, he served in U.S. Army Blue in the Spanish-American War. They could totally put him as a major general in Army Blue. They chose to put him in his Confederate uniform in 1924 because it reflected the values of a segregationist apartheid state. So you can change that. We can change it. We've changed it in the Department of Defense, and guess what? Still solid foundation, And I went and called Lee a traitor for slavery in front of Lee Chapel. I wasn't struck by lightning. I wasn't swallowed whole in the ground. History is uncomfortable. But you know what? Neither Floridians nor Americans are made out of cotton candy. We can handle uncomfortable because it causes no lasting damage. It just makes us a better, more inclusive country that represents the values that we love and cherish.
Thank you, Ty.
I give long answers. I'm sorry. You're not going to
No,
get through
no,
all
no,
everything
no,
there.
no. I'm going to ask people, remember your index cards. If you want to ask questions, please write them down and hold them up so that our team can come by and pick them up. But before we turn to the Q&A, there were a couple of questions that came in from registration. And there's a question about a number of January 6th insurrectionists are former military and law enforcement. Love to hear your thoughts on that. Does the military stress the importance of our democracy?
So it's a great question. So January 6th occurred, and I saw the flag of treason, the flag of slavery, the flag of that Confederate flag, Confederate battle flag, by the way. You know, the United Daughters of the Confederacy chose that flag in the 1890s. It wasn't the original Confederate flag, or the second and third flag had mainly a white background. Why white? Because that's what they were fighting for. They were fighting for the supremacy of the white race. And unfortunately, or fortunately, a white flag on the battlefield, not a great idea. But when I saw that flag of treason go in there, when it had never made it in the 1860s, man, I was hot. I was ready to put the uniform back on and go kick some butt. I'm glad to say that guy who drove that in there is now a convicted felon, and that the rule of law has won out in that from those insurrectionists. Remember, they would not accept the results of a democratic election and chose insurrection. Just that guy brought that Confederate flag in there because he knew what he was doing. That's exactly what he was doing when he was trying to do that. So we had when Secretary Lloyd Austin took over, he had a Secretary of Defense. He had a stand-down day to make sure that we're looking at that. We bring 10,000 people a month into the U.S. Army. I don't think it's a big problem. I think what is a bigger problem is what is somebody going to do that orders the Army to do something unconstitutional? What's going to happen then? I think that is the grave threat. Is what happens when you're given an unlawful order. We're taught in the Army that you obey the orders of the President of the United States, even if he has the right to be wrong, but he does not have the right to be unconstitutional. But how do we determine that? You don't want your military trying to figure out what is you know what an immoral order is, you know what an illegal order is, but man, unconstitutional is really hard. So what worries me is if it is given an order that is illegal. And so that worries me far more than the amount of people that are in there, because the officer corps. Let me say this one more thing. We are one of the only countries in the history of the world that has never had a military coup d'etat. I am extraordinarily proud of that. Extraordinarily proud. The reason we have a great military is because we reflect and represent a great country. So I don't ever want to think that if you think I'm criticizing a thing, as the great James Baldwin said, he said, I love my country more than any other, and that's why I criticize her. You can love your country and want to change it. You can love your city and want to change it. You can love your state and your organization, but if you know it better, then you're going to criticize it because you love it so much.
Thank you. So I do have a bunch of questions from the audience. And this first one is from Tim Kerr. What was your dad's reaction to your shift?
Well, my dad's still alive, 92, lives in the Villages. He's 92, his 97-year-old tennis partner, he and his 97-year-old tennis partner are the Florida State over 90 tennis doubles champion. They were the only entry. So when I first started on this journey, I've been talking to him about it for a long time, and I think he finally he went to Swan, he went to the University of the South, where this sort of he was inculcated, born on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. He's an orphan and went up onto the mountain there in the Cumberland Plateau from the 7th grade until he graduated from Sewanee. Then went to Episcopal High School for for much of his career. So I think at the end, as I was going through these changes and talking to him about it, I believe that he loves me more than Robert E. Lee. but it's close.
Okay. All right. It turns out, okay, next question is actually for me. Miss Jessie Ball DuPont was against desegregation and actively fought against it. How do you reconcile that history with the fund's current mission? Thank you, Bill.
All right.
So we have been talking a fair amount in various conferences about how we tackle Jessie Ball DuPont's legacy, because Jessie was incredibly generous, and she was generous long before she had money to give away. She was in the habit of funding scholarships for the kids that she taught when she was a high school teacher, and then got married to Alfred I. DuPont, one of the wealthiest Americans, and got to be even more generous. But she used her philanthropy in certain contexts to essentially hold the line against integration. She was a committed segregationist, and in letters with her friends, she talked openly about defending white supremacy. So it is, gives us pause to try and come to terms with the fact that our founder and funder believed in those things. But we have tried in our own way to say, okay, so she cared. She cared about the communities she funded, Jacksonville among them, Port St. Joe, the Northern Neck. She cared about the institutions she funded, the University of the South among them, Washington and Lee. But we believe fundamentally that for those communities and institutions to thrive and to prosper, they have to be radically inclusive, because people bring very different experiences and knowledge and understanding to challenges. And for each of these institutions and communities to weather the challenges of the present, they have to be radically inclusive spaces so that we can get everyone in the community pulling for the solutions that we need to fight poverty, to fight climate change, all these gnarly problems that we face. We know that we have to leverage every single person. So we have made inclusion a cornerstone of our grant funding and support of organizations. And I will also note that these same institutions that Jessie supported because she believed they were the last line of defense against integration are themselves changing. So whether it's the University of the South or Stratford Hall, each institution in its time, committed to the lost cause, they too are on a journey to figure out how they can repair the wrongs that they committed. And so we are honored to be able to support those grantees in their journey. And so, it's an and. She was generous and she was a segregationist. She was a white supremacist, but look at what her grantees are doing today. So we walk a fine line. We try to be honest about what's going on with our own journey around reckoning with Jessie's legacy. So that's our responsibility. Next is, while wearing the uniform, did your freedom to speak about the Civil War differ depending on who was commander-in-chief? That was an anonymous question, by the way.
I mean, here's the thing. It was, when I first got in trouble, it was under President Obama. Oh. So when I first got in trouble, because it wasn't President Obama that was reaching down there, it was the U.S. Army. And they were like freaking out because I was getting all this publicity. And they had this problem, which is, so I recorded this like in the early 2015, and it came out a month after the massacre of black churchgoers in Charleston. And so the Army was having to deal with the fact that all these posts were named after these traitors for slavery. And they gave this terrible answer, which is, they represent the American military tradition, and they're about our heritage. I mean, it was awful. It was awful because because the more you look into these people, they had nothing to do with it. So then once Charlottesville came, and I wrote an op-ed, and then I didn't try to publish it because I went to talk to my bosses, and they were like, and I self-censored. I totally self-censored. They might have let me do it, but then I would have brought, as one of the chief staff of the Army once said, that Trump would Twitter slap them. They had no idea it was coming, and then it was just like whap. So I didn't want to do that to the institutions that I love. So I waited until I retired, and then with full academic freedom, then I just kept writing. But I self-censored under the Trump administration, I guess is the best way to say it. Because I got in trouble under the Obama administration.
Great. Next question is actually from Connor. What myths or visions of the Confederates are the most appealing to Americans, and how would you recommend countering them?
Oh, thank you. All right. Let's go after Robert E. Lee, shall we? That's the one. If you need somebody to dunk on Robert E. Lee, I'm your man. So that's the one that often because people grew up, as I did, with this myth of the kindly General Lee. So the first thing we should say about Lee is that there were 8 U.S. Army colonels from Virginia, all West Point graduates, in 1861. 7 chose to remain with the United States, and only 1 chose treason. Why? He took 2 years of paid administrative leave to run plantations, except I don't like to call them plantations, because slave plantations, were the site of mass atrocities. They were gulags. Remember that for those who trace their heritage to the enslaved era, often there is 20 to 25% European DNA because rape was so ubiquitous. This is an evil and immoral system which Lee fought to retain. When he was running these gulags, he separated all the families through the hiring system, where his father-in-law kept them together. During the war itself, and he had enslaved people whipped, which we know, and then poured salt water on their wounds. When he went north during the Antietam and Gettysburg campaign, every part of his army captured free black people in Pennsylvania and Maryland and brought them back to have them resold in Virginia. During the war, his army slaughtered black prisoners of war routinely. His army consisted of enslaved labor for logistics. So he fought immorally for an immoral cause. The Confederates were evil because what they fought for was evil. And as long as you get nothing else out of my talk tonight, remember that the Confederates fought an immoral war for an immoral cause. The next thing is, remember that after the war, Lee testifies before Congress during Reconstruction. What would he do, if it was up to him, what would he do with the black citizens, now citizens, of Virginia? He said if it was up to him, he would kick everyone out of the state. Ethnic cleansing. So this is an unreconstructed. He does, and the other thing is, well, what about his treason? He wasn't tried for it. Well, he was indicted for treason, and in December of 1868, Christmas Day, Andrew Johnson pardoned him and every other Confederate, granted amnesty for the crime of treason. So remember that when we have these romantic notions of the Confederacy, no. And then if you think about this era after the war, why did Reconstruction, that period, 1865 to 1877, when there's a chance at biracial democracy, when there are 2,000 black men who hold elected office, when there's a black senator from Mississippi, when South Carolina and Mississippi are majority black communities, what happens? It is white political terror campaign that steals that biracial democracy that we had a chance to do and institutes a Jim Crow racial police state that lasts for generations. Could you say that when does the United States become a democracy? I think you could argue that it's not until the late 1960s and even into the 1970s that the United States of America becomes a democracy. How could it be a democracy when 35 to 40% of its citizens in the American South can't vote?
So I see that academic freedom and books are on a lot of people's minds here. There are multiple questions here about how might we best protect academic freedom here in Florida, especially at the public universities, and how, and also the move to ban books in various school systems. How do you think we might best counter those threats?
So we are in a period of nativism and reaction to equal rights right now. We should understand it in the broad scope of American history. Reconstruction, or correction, the end of slavery begats this Ku Klux Klan. Reconstruction begets the Jim Crow era. The civil rights movement begets the sort of George Wallace white populism, Southern strategy of the Republicans. Obama begets the Tea Party. Black Lives Matter begets Trump in a way. So you can see, or MAGA. So you can see that there's a reaction here. But I want to give you hope here. So there are all these things that people are going after. But remember, which is more powerful, cultural power or political power? I would argue that cultural power is far more powerful. So if you think Gore Vidal, the famous sort of mid-century intellectual, once said that the person who screens the history makes the history. The person who screens the history makes the history. Song of the South, Gone with the Wind, Birth of a Nation, all of those movies were the one. I didn't grow up on Birth of a Nation as too. I'm not that old, but I remember the first time Gone with the Wind came on national television, 1975. My whole family walked around our 20-inch TV. So now, what do kids get now? 13th, Harriet, Django Unchained, Emancipation, Underground Railroad. All of these movies they have already, those people who are trying to take us back, they've already lost. There's this thing you might have heard of, it's called the internet. You can't hide. If you have not seen the crash courses, these are our YouTube videos by John Green. There's also one by Clint Smith called Black American History. These short 20-minute videos that kids are getting all the time. They're wonderful. You can't hide the truth anymore. The truth is ruthless. The truth is ruthless. So remember to think about this. Fight it everywhere you can. But the reason that they are fighting so hard to ban books, they can't do it. Now, the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the early part of the 20th century, very successful in burning a lot of books in the South to ensure that children knew that the Civil War was about slavery. That's no longer the case. So I feel hopeful that this is a retrograde mode. Now, listen, I'm up in upstate New York. It's all fine up there. You know what I mean? I know that if to be a K through 12 teacher here or to be a college professor, that's a scary business. So I don't mean to undermine that. It is scary business when you don't have academic freedom. But I know teachers down here, you can still teach the facts. And how can you read the secession declarations and not understand that the Civil War is about slavery? How can you read about the Ku Klux Klan and not know that? They can't hide the truth. And so it's incumbent upon all of us, historians and anyone, to know, here's what you should do, to know the history of your town, of your community, of your family, of yourself, of your nation. And if you know that, then you can ensure. I have a 14-month-old grandson. Let me tell you, what a great gig that is. I am loving it. But I know he is not going to grow up with the same lies that I did. He will not have that same lies that I did. And that, to me, is something that we have a responsibility to ensure all of our grandkids and children don't do that. And I know it's coming. The kids are not going to fall for this stuff. You can't hide truth.
So there are a couple of questions about Lee, about Robert E. Lee, and some are sort of shadings of Robert E. Lee, maybe revisionism. Some authors have written that Robert E. Lee accepted leading the role in the Northern Virginia Division reluctantly, ? Is it documented that he told the Confederate leaders they would lose the war? And why did Lee's estate get turned in? What was a real reason the Lees left and it turned into Arlington Cemetery? So
there's a letter that a great historian, I'm forgetting her name right now, found this one letter, and I think it may have come from Stratford. That Lee's daughter wrote soon after the decision he made to choose treason, to go with the South. And she said that she was surprised, her mother was surprised, and in fact, he did this well before his sons, so he went with the South. I would believe that he left his regiment in Texas for more than 2 years to run this enslaved labor farm. He thought more like a Southern planter than he did an Army officer, which explains his difference. The difference. The other thing that he did was he could have freed the enslaved on Arlington and sold property to free them immediately. His father-in-law said the enslaved have to be freed within 5 years. He kept them as long as he possibly could. So he went early in that period to go fight first for Virginia. And I did have somebody once say, I think it was a cousin, I'm not sure who it was, that once said, I will, when I see in my commission that it says anything about my state, I will go with that. So he took the oath of office 3 weeks before he chose treason, when he accepted a rank of colonel to command the 1st Cavalry Regiment. So throughout this time, he made decisions that were unusual. 80% of slave state colonels in the Army in 1861 chose to remain with the United States. He was an outlier. The brave men who chose to stay with the United States, like George Thomas and others, there's no statue to him. Why aren't there statues to those who remain loyal to this country, who fought in blue, who, in the words of the statue at West Point, freed a race and welded a nation? That's who we should be celebrating. Why celebrate a loser who fought to... this is the other thing we should remember. Does anybody think it's a good thing that if the Confederacy won? Think about what that would have meant. The enslaved went from, in 1840, there were 2.5 million enslaved. By 1860, it was 4 million. The price of enslaved people were an all-time high in 1860. It wasn't a society with slaves, it was a slave society. 85% of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, had a direct benefit from enslaved people. In the state of Mississippi and Alabama, 50% of families owned enslaved people. This wasn't going away anytime soon. And it was the U.S. Army that did this. The white South sowed the wind and they reaped the whirlwind. We need to stop. There is just no reason that we should hold up that these are exemplars of honor, that they deserve statues. Those statues are there to support white supremacy that came in between 1890 and 1920. They don't reflect the values of this soldier at this time in America.
And I believe this is the last question. Since no man is without sin, did the idea of naming forts after units or divisions get consideration?
Oh, we considered everything. Let me tell you, if we considered Fort Brittany Spears, we considered everything, let me tell you. But we wanted stories. The thing is, facts don't change people's minds. They really don't. But stories do. Why is it that movies are so valuable to us, so good? It's because they're stories. That's what I tried to do in a book, is to try to tell a story by telling stories. Storytelling is what changes people's minds. Since we first gathered around fire, that's the way we do it. And so the idea that we would name these things after divisions, yes, we could do it. But I'm telling you now, every soldier that goes to Fort Gregg Adams outside Petersburg, Virginia, which is a historically black community, here's the story of Arthur Gregg and Charity Adams. Charity Adams commanded the 688th Postal Battalion. She's a hero. That's the highest ranking black woman in World War II. She worked those women so that they delivered the mail. You know what a hero is to this soldier who's deployed? It's getting mail on time, let me tell you. I love it. So yeah, she's a hero, Charity Adams. The other one is Arthur Gregg. Arthur Gregg was the highest ranking black logistics officer when he retired in 1980. Remember that the logistics branches in the U.S. Army there at that fort, it used to be called Fort Lee, is 50% African American. It's the most diverse workforce in the country. And that Arthur Gregg, not only did he integrate, he was in the logistics branch, he integrated the Fort Lee Officers Club. And when we did that name change, it was like going to church, let me tell you. And Arthur Gregg gave the speech. He's 95 years old, still alive, still there to be an inspiration to every soldier. So when you go to Fort Gregg Adams, you hear the story of Arthur Gregg and Charity Adams, and every soldier will be inspired. We couldn't tell the story of Robert E. Lee, but you can tell the story of Arthur Gregg. You can tell the story of Charity Adams because they reflect the values of America in 2024, the America that we want to be a part of, the America that's an inspiration to all of us. And if we don't have those inspiration, why not? There are so many heroes in Jacksonville, in America, that we can choose. Choose heroes.
Amen. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Ty, for a rousing discussion. And for those of you who signed up for the People's Supper, in 10 minutes or so, we will head up to the lecture hall upstairs and gather around the table, break bread, and continue the discussion. So for those of you who wrote questions that didn't get read, I'm sorry. We hope we might be able to continue the discussion. It will be structured and it'll be facilitated, but we hope that we can continue to mull over some of Ty's stories. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maury. Thank you, everyone.